Hello, this is Praccy, and this is going to be my review for Strike Suit Zero Director's Cut on the PC, and by extension the PS4 and Xbox One. This is essentially an updated remake of the original release of Strike Suit Zero, with a few things changed in the Director's Cut version. I'll be talking about those a little bit later on, but just in case that's what you're mainly interested in, I'll drop an annotation with the link to when I start discussing the difference between the versions.
The Colonials intercepted the transmission containing your flight plan. They have diverted ships to investigate the source. Those fighters are just the beginning. More ships are approaching. If you do not leave within the correct time frame, there is a 98% probability that you will lose the war. If we leave in time, we can reduce the probability to a manageable 87%.
Strike Suit Zero is a single-player 3D space shooter in which you're expected to pilot the prototype Strike Suit space fighter and play your part in an interstellar war between two separate entities. The gameplay focuses mostly on arcade-style action, leaving Strike Suit Zero feeling more like a Devil May Cry game in space, rather than games you might be tempted to make a direct comparison with based on its genre alone, such as Wing Commander or the X-Wing series. As such, what you get is essentially a rather shallow experience, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad one. The plot is actually surprisingly good and way better than I expected, but frankly I was expecting almost no plot whatsoever. It's definitely not going to win any awards for writing, but I thought it was immersive enough to keep me interested. The plot revolves around a deteriorated relationship between Earth and a large colonist force sent out to scout for the location of an alien signal. Upon finding the source of the signal and researching the object, the colonists forcibly ejected Earth's forces, sparking a major war, wanting to keep the artifact for themselves and fearing what Earth might do with it if they were to unlock its secrets. Eventually this all comes to a head with the colonist forces launching a massive attack on Earth which threatens to end the war once and for all. The player takes on the role of a pilot who has been given control of a prototype strike suit by a top-secret artificial intelligence, playing an important part in the master plan of this AI to save Earth from the impending colonist fleet. Now, while I don't think the plot is anything groundbreaking in the slightest, I felt the execution was rather well done. The story is mostly told through radio chatter between various characters, who are all reasonably interesting in their own right, and as such, I didn't feel as if the plot was wasting my time, which is what I was initially expecting.
You know the drill. Don't let those torpedoes anywhere near the Arcadia.
The gameplay resembles something perhaps closer to a 3D shoot-'em-up game, in a vein similar to retro 2D space shooters, except with an extra dimension thrown in. If you're wanting an in-depth space combat simulation, this isn't going to be the game for you, and I can tell you that now. Strike Suit Zero revolves around combat in the aforementioned strike suits, in which you'll be expected to aid in the dispatch of huge numbers of enemy spaceships. And if Earth is planning to survive the war, then you're going to have to beat all the odds and punch well above your weight in any encounters. The strike suit differs from regular fighters in that it has a strike mode, which is a powered up attack mode which feeds off flux, a resource gained by killing enemies. When you're in strike mode, you'll find yourself much more maneuverable and able to auto-target enemy ships, as well as fire Panzer Dragoon style swarms of missiles across multiple targets. So I suppose it's fairly needless to say that strike mode is quite overpowered. There are actually other spaceships to use without a strike mode, but they're usually involved in gimmick missions, and as such they aren't very versatile, or dare I say it, fun to use. More or less the whole game consists of combat with radio chatter during the fight and afterward to keep you clued in on the story. You'll be expected to dogfight with other fighters, against which you have the massive advantage of your strike mode, as well as take on larger ships, which will take a good deal of time and effort to take down. I would actually say that the game does a very good job of keeping the combat fast and frantic throughout, and that's very much in its credit. You always feel pressed for time, like you could be doing something to increase your score, something which is rather important when it comes to the ending of the game. Your performance in a mission will directly affect the readiness of Earth for the impending colonist fleet. As such, you'll want to get gold or platinum rankings at the end of missions if you're wanting the good ending. But there is one major drawback to the gameplay, and that is that things are very repetitive, with the style of fighting required to complete a mission being something that will barely change for the whole game. Ultimately, each mission is just a race to take down priority targets as quickly as possible. Although sometimes you will get escort mission objectives thrown in, and I'm sure by now everybody loves escort missions.
Mercury has been destroyed. Mission failed. Earth is lost.
The controls are a little confusing at first, mostly because there's quite a few keys to memorize and it's a touch overwhelming. I haven't played Strike Suit Zero on a controller, but I could easily imagine that it would be a little bit easier to get to grips with. But once you get the hang of it, controlling the strike suit is pretty easy and feels very fluid. Strike mode gives you a lot of options that can make controlling yourself a lot easier. For example, one of the main problems you'll find is it takes quite a lot of time to orient yourself to shoot at a target. However, if you switch to strike mode, you'll be able to auto-target whatever it is you're wanting to be facing, and then switch back to normal fighter mode if you'd like. You'll definitely want to get to grips with the controls as well, because the style of combat that you'll most likely be forced to employ is one that focuses heavily on multitasking. You're going to have to keep your target in your sights, protect the target, evade damage, and keep track of the flux meter all at once. Missile lock-ons are probably the best example of this, designed specifically to test your multitasking skills. They require you to fire an EMP just as the lock-on tone tells you it's close enough and no earlier. So I would say that I was actually very impressed with how well this game controls. The only real issue is that sometimes the targeting system can be a little bit fiddly and it can take a lot of effort to actually target the thing that you'd like. Now, checking out other reviews for Strike Suit Zero, difficulty seems to be something that people are talking about a lot. I have honestly no idea why. I've had no problem with the difficulty whatsoever, but this is coming from somebody with a reasonable amount of experience with video gaming in general. But, thankfully, for those who are finding it a bit hard, the Director's Cut version has the option of an easy mode as well as a normal and hardcore difficulty mode. Some of the escort missions can be a little bit frustrating, but I don't think it's enough to complain about, and with the correct level of skill and the correct priority of targeting, you should be able to keep these ships alive rather easily. I'm not sure what other reviewers have been doing in order to have so many problems with the difficulty. The rinse and repeat strategy for the whole game is more or less strike mode to kill fighters as often as possible, try not to get hit by missiles, and as soon as your shields drop below about 20%, think about flying away to regenerate. That's it. The rest simply hinges on your ability to handle increasingly frantic situations. I will admit that the game is hardest just before you get the knack of playing it, but once things start to flow and feel more natural, it won't really matter how many ships are being thrown at you. You should be an unstoppable death machine.
Ready. Preparing to fold out.
As a quick note, the soundtrack is as repetitive as the gameplay, but it's not such a bad thing since for what little you get, it is rather excellent. It certainly gives the game a very anime feel, which works very well with the whole mecha theme. Actually, in many ways, I get the impression Strike Suit Zero is a game made by developers who wish they were Japanese. Now it's time to talk about exactly what makes the Director's Cut version a Director's Cut. First of all, there's been a lot of new lines of dialogue added to help flesh out the story, which is helpful because it was a little bit vague in the original version. Secondly, some of the missions have been restructured a little bit to make them less frustrating. For example, in the original game, you would only get the strike suit halfway through Mission 3. In this game, you get it on Mission 2. But the third and final change is that there's been a fairly significant graphical upgrade. The Director's Cut version has been developed for the latest generation of consoles, and as such the graphics, and especially the models, have received an overhaul. All of the textures have been cleaned up a good deal, the HUD is in higher definition, and the effects are a bit flashier. That said, it's still not an amazing game in terms of graphics alone. I do however think it looks great, mainly due to the aesthetics. It's very hard to concentrate on when you're actually playing the game, but dogfighting does look rather spectacular with a pre-rendered backdrop of an exploding planet. The only problem is that the space between ships can feel a little bit empty, but I can imagine that's one of the major problems with space, hence the name. Whether it looks better enough for owners of the original Strike Suit Zero to upgrade to Director's Cut, however, I'm not entirely sure about. You'll probably have to judge for yourself, but from the video alone it'll be hard to tell the difference between the two versions thanks to YouTube's encoder flattening the bitrate. But if you want my opinion, it is better looking, but it's not better enough to pay any extra money for. I've also seen a lot of people on the Steam forum who've been suffering from buggy graphics and poor performance, but personally I've had no problems so far, so I'm sort of assuming that at least most of the issues have been patched by now. I would, however, definitely say that the Director's Cut is the definitive version of Strike Suit Zero. Born Ready Games, the developer of Strike Suit Zero, is a rather small studio, and I think under the circumstances they've done much better than I'd expect from an indie studio. I'm not really sure if that's a compliment or not. So do I recommend Strike Suit Zero Director's Cut? Well, it's not so easy to say. I definitely enjoyed it a great deal and I don't regret buying both versions. However, I don't know if there's enough in the Director's Cut version for most players of the original version to justify picking it up. Thankfully, for a limited time on Steam, owners of the original Strike Suit Zero will be able to buy the Director's Cut at an 85% reduction in price, but that still may be a little steep for what is essentially the same game. Also, I think the price tag makes this a painful purchase for new players. £15 for what will probably be at best a 6 to 8 hour experience is a bit expensive. So for the vast majority of people, I'd say that you should hold off until there's a price drop or until you can get yourself a better deal somehow. However, if you're like me and you're addicted to space games but you also appreciate a bit of action, then Strike Suit Zero should be perfect for you. It's not going to be the sort of game you look back on as being a masterpiece, but it does manage to achieve above average levels of fun for at least one playthrough. That sounds negative, but in many ways it's exactly what a video game should achieve, and by today's standards I find that a lot of releases from many much larger developers don't even manage that. Well, I honestly hope that somebody found this review at least barely interesting, and maybe I'll see you next time. I really hate that I say that at the end of all my videos. At least it's technically not at the end now.